G'day everyone, Ben the Spider Seeker here, and I've got an exciting new toy. It's a digital microscope. It makes this little spider look a lot bigger, and it's a whitetail spider. It's been a while since I made a video about them, and since then I've done a bit more reading and a bit more talking to experts, and what I've come to conclude is that they really are not dangerous. So what I want to outline today is where the confusion came from and how it was cleared up, but still kind of persists. So I'll start off with confirming that this is a whitetail spider. So I'll just open the lid on my very nice clear enclosure here and get him into a spot where I can point. So this part here, this is the abdomen. And on a whitetail spider, it's elongated, so cigar-shaped or tube or tapered tube, basically longer than it is, so longer that way than it is wide. And on the tip is a white tail. And on this one, we've got a couple of little extra marks. So we've got this mark here, 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 and here, and we've got some banding on the legs. That's a fairly strong indication that it's actually a young spider, so not fully grown. But when it fully spreads out from the tip of this little toe here, all the way up to that one, it's about 2.5 centimeters. So this microscope is making it look a lot bigger. The other thing that is very much common to whitetails is these front 4 legs. So the front 2 pairs of legs are thicker than the others. Now, it's ended up tucked into a corner where it's nice and comfy, so I won't try and spread it out too much, but you can see this leg is very thick, and so are these two. This one here is a lot thinner though. It's actually a lot thinner than any of the other legs. That's a good indicator that this leg at some point was removed somehow. Whether it was injured and the spider removed it itself, or whether it was torn off while it was hunting one of its favourite prey. But it is slowly growing back. Now close up the lid again, just in case the spider gets a bit excited and tries to move. Now, its favourite food happens to be other spiders, specifically web-building spiders like house spiders and redback spiders. Now, being that they're common around the house and like the structures that our houses provide, that also means whitetails will come in after them. So you'll probably find them in sheds, garages, roof spaces, or other nooks and crannies around the house. If you have a brick home or a house with a lot of little cracks and all that sort of, all the hidey holes that they love in it, you'll find them in there as well. And the thing about whitetails is they are active hunters. Just going to move the lid, ready to close it if it starts moving. There we go. Now, being that they're active hunters, they do actually like to hide during the day, and that's where you'll find them under cupboards, behind things, in linen or in clothing that's sort of hanging or sitting on the floor. But where I find a lot of mine is sort of up high on walls tucked into the cornice. Now, being common around the house is actually how they ended up blamed for everything. But it started back in the 1950s. So there were these mentions in publications and at conferences of a term called necrotizing arachnidism. So necrotizing meaning flesh decaying or dying, and arachnidism referring to it being caused by an arachnid, whether that's a bite from a spider or a sting from a scorpion. And there are a couple of arachnids in the world, only a couple, that do have necrotoxins. Weirdly enough, they're not in Australia. Now, these mentions and publications didn't actually have any reported cases to go alongside the term, so there wasn't actually a clinical description, which isn't, and it doesn't really take much of a stretch of the imagination to see that, well, we've got this term, it has no clinical description because there's no cases, and as a result there was no spiders yet attributed to it. And that didn't happen until the 80s. And Dr. Robert Raven, a well-known Australian arachnologist, talks about this point in an ABC podcast. I'll link that in the description. Basically, a medical doctor had a patient with a pretty unpleasant wound, and they'd heard about this thing called necrotizing arachnoidism. And I can sort of see the thought process of, wouldn't it be cool to have the first case of necrotizing arachnoidism? Let's search the patient's house. So they went with their assistant to the patient's house and they found 14 spiders. Of those 14 spiders, there were no whitetails. 0 whitetails were found. But the reasoning was, whitetails are common, therefore it's a whitetail spider bite. They got blamed for not even being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They literally were not there. Anyway, following that first case, there was a slew of diagnosed cases throughout the 80s and 90s, research articles making reference to these diagnoses and examining the clinical effects and follow on, blindly attributing those cases to whitetails. And once they found no necrotoxins in the venom, that is toxins that actually cause necrosis, they started looking at gut chemistry, so looking into possible mechanisms for the bites to become necrotic, rather than questioning whether or not they're actually causing them in the first place. Now, this resulted in the suggestion that whitetails would sort of vomit when they bit, and as a result of their gut chemistry, it would start eating away at the flesh. So, whitetails basically became the bogeyman of Australian spiders, more feared than any other spider, hiding under beds, biting people and causing horrific wounds without ever being seen at the scene of the crime. Never being seen. This didn't sit well with a few researchers. It's in the late 90s. We started to see letters to the editor and articles started calling for an examination of confirmed spider bites. Now, you don't often see emotion in research articles, but you could feel the tension. You could feel the aggravation that something wasn't right. So rather than just examining diagnosed cases, Doctors Isbister and Gray started looking at confirmed bite cases. That is, cases where the spider bite was witnessed and the spider was identified. And they published their findings in 2002. Their examination of 750 spider bites from various Australian spiders. And what they found was no necrotic lesions. They actually found a very low rate of secondary infection, less than 1%. So they went even further, and in 2003 they published 130 confirmed whitetail bites. Both studies found no signs of necrotizing arachnoidism from any Australian spiders. They suggested that investigation should happen into cases to find the actual cause and inform proper, accurate treatment. And in 2004, Dr. Isbister partnered up with Dr. White this time, investigating 11 cases. So it went even further and looked at 11 cases that had been diagnosed as whitetail spider bites. And what they found was amazing. All of them had an alternative diagnosis to go with them that could have been found with a bit of investigation. And it was a variety. So there was 5 cases of Staphylococcus infections, 2 cases of dermatophytosis, 1 case of pyoderma gangrenosum, a case of cutaneous polyarteritis nodosa, and 1 case of nocardia brasiliensis, and to top it off, an infected diabetic ulcer. Yes, I did practice those. The range of different types of wounds and infections shows the poor clinical description that necrotizing arachnoidism has, and how unreliable it is as a diagnosis, especially when you consider the actual causes and the potential consequences of just a poorly informed treatment. So, really, the underlying issue that led to the complete misunderstanding and decades of misdiagnosis, to be brutally honest, was just a failure of the scientific method. In science, theories are informed and built around evidence. Conditions under which the theories are tested are very carefully constructed and measured. In the case of whitetails, a theory was published with no cases and therefore no clear clinical description in the 50s. 3 decades later, that theory was used as the basis for a diagnosis which lacked any evidence of spider involvement, with no whitetails even found. 2 decades of using the initial diagnosis as justification for further diagnoses. Research was then informed by those diagnoses with no further investigation done to confirm that a spider was involved. Evidence was basically fabricated to fit a theory. No clear investigation to confirm the cause, which then created a bias in the research that was done and therefore created a bias in public opinion. The most damning thing really in this case is how remarkably poorly known the whitetail spiders were before the 1980s. They just suddenly seemed to appear on the scene as the most dangerous spider in Australia. It's very unlikely that something so common and so dangerous would go unknown for so long. So what should have happened? In essence, nothing. That theory shouldn't have been presented in the first place. There were no clinical cases. It shouldn't have been reported on at all as something that was a risk in Australia until there was some evidence that it could be. What should have happened is, if a spider bite was observed and confirmed, it should have been reported by a patient with any presentation towards getting medical intervention. Ideally, you catch the spider and it's there for an actual diagnosis. And once you start seeing some consistencies in the clinical presentation of these bites, then it might be worth publishing. So really, it's kind of a remarkable story for a remarkably well-adapted hunter that is the whitetail spider. And that's pretty much what it is. It's a story. And I think I'll leave that story there for now. But basically, if you're enjoying this, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And then, of course, checking out some of the other videos I have. Some of them are better than others, even in my opinion. I'm still working on our schedule for regular uploads, and I'll keep trying and keep everyone updated. For now, though, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.